The farmhouse door groaned open under Owen's palm. 3 weeks since he'd signed the papers. 3 weeks since he'd walked away to scrape together money for repairs. The scent stopped him cold. Warm bread, yeast, and butter. Impossibly alive in a place meant to be dead. Kenny's small fingers tightened around his. Footsteps shuffled behind the peeling kitchen doorway. Then silence. 2 women emerged slowly, flour dusting their hands like snow, eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from having nowhere left to run. Owen's chest tightened. This crumbling farmhouse was supposed to be salvation, the last thread of hope he could offer his son after losing everything else. But those faces, that hollow, desperate recognition mirroring back at him, he'd bought this place to bury his past. He hadn't expected to find it living in someone else's eyes. Owen had learned to measure time in shifts. Morning shift at the warehouse, 4 in the morning until noon. Afternoon delivering packages until 6. Evening cooking dinner for Kenny, helping with homework, tucking him into bed, with stories about the farmhouse they'd built together. The stories were the only part that didn't hurt. Kenny's eyes would light up talking about chickens and vegetable gardens, about having space to run without neighbors banging on walls. At 7 years old, the boy still remembered the house they'd lost, still asked sometimes why Mommy couldn't come back from the hospital. Owen had stopped trying to explain that some debts swallow everything, that medical bills don't care about grief or little boys who need their mothers. The farmhouse listing had appeared on a Tuesday, buried deep in a rural county website most people never bothered checking. 60 acres, mostly wild. Structure described as needing significant work, which was realtor language for nearly condemned. The price made Owen's heart skip, barely more than what he'd saved driving himself into exhaustion for 18 months. He'd driven out the next weekend, Kenny asleep in the passenger seat, following dirt roads that seemed to lead nowhere. The property sat at the end of a path more suggestion than driveway, surrounded by overgrown fields that had once been farmland. The house itself sagged in places, paint peeling like sunburned skin, but the bones looked solid. Oak beams, stone foundation, a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Owen had walked every room with Kenny's hand in his. Imagining. The kitchen could be restored. The upstairs bedrooms needed new floors but had good light. The barn out back was half collapsed, but salvageable. Most importantly, it was theirs. No landlord threatening eviction. No neighbors complaining about a kid running in the hallway. Space for Kenny to be a child, to have the childhood Owen's wife had dreamed of giving him before the cancer stole her away. He'd signed the papers that afternoon, using every cent he had. The lawyer had looked at him like he was crazy. Maybe he was. But crazy was better than the alternative, which was giving up entirely. He'd spent that first weekend making the place minimally safe, boarding up broken windows, clearing debris, testing the well pump that miraculously still worked. The roof leaked in 2 places, but he'd deal with that when he had money for supplies. Kenny had explored every corner, declaring it perfect despite the decay, already naming invisible chickens and planning where to plant tomatoes. Owen had felt something he'd almost forgotten. Possibility. They'd driven back to the city Sunday night, Owen already calculating how many extra shifts he'd need to afford basic materials. 3 weeks, he'd told Kenny. 3 weeks to save enough to start real repairs, then they'd come back and begin building their new life. 3 weeks that apparently hadn't been empty at all. The taller woman spoke first, voice barely above a whisper. We didn't know anyone had bought it. The realtor said it had been sitting for 2 years. Her hands twisted in her apron, flour and something that might have been embroidery, homemade and worn. The younger one stood half behind her, protectively close, eyes darting between Owen and the door like a trapped animal calculating escape routes. They looked exhausted in a way Owen recognized intimately, the kind of tired that came from too many nights without real sleep, too many days without knowing where the next meal would come from. Owen should have been furious. Should have demanded they leave immediately, called the sheriff, protected what little he'd managed to claim for his son. But Kenny's grip on his hand had loosened, curiosity replacing fear, and Owen found himself seeing not intruders, but reflections. The way the older woman held herself, shoulders squared, despite obvious terror, reminded him of his wife in those final hospital days, dignified in the face of circumstances that offered no dignity. The younger one's protective stance mirrored how he positioned himself between Kenny and every threat the world threw at them. They weren't thieves. They were survivors, doing what survivors do. "How long have you been here?" The question came out gentler than Owen intended. The older woman swallowed hard. 5 days. We saw it was empty. Thought maybe we could stay just until we figured something out. We've been keeping it clean, haven't damaged anything. We can leave right now if—" "Where would you go?" Owen interrupted. The question hung in the dusty air between them. The woman's face crumpled slightly before she caught herself, rebuilding that fragile dignity. Nowhere, obviously. People with somewhere to go didn't break into abandoned farmhouses. Her name was Hazel, and the younger woman was her sister Rosie. They sat at the old kitchen table Owen had left behind, stories spilling out in fragments, between silences heavy with shame. Their parents had died 8 months ago in a house fire that took everything. Family, home, photographs, the small savings their father had tucked in a coffee can. Insurance had covered the funeral costs, and nothing more. Hazel had been working 2 jobs trying to support them both, but Rosie's heart condition made steady employment impossible. The medications alone consumed most of what Hazel earned, and when she'd missed too many shifts caring for Rosie during a bad episode, she'd lost both positions within the same week. The apartment had gone next, then the car when they couldn't afford payments. They'd cycled through shelters for months, but Rosie's condition worsened in the crowded, stressful environments. Chest pains, irregular heartbeat, trips to emergency rooms they couldn't afford. A social worker had mentioned rural properties, sometimes sat empty, suggested looking outside the city where they might find temporary refuge, somewhere quiet while they regrouped. They'd taken a bus as far as their remaining money allowed, walked until they found this place. 5 days of peace, Hazel said, her voice cracking slightly. 5 days where Rosie could breathe without sirens and shouting, where they could pretend they had a home again. Kenny had migrated toward Rosie during the conversation, drawn by the sketches she'd been nervously running her fingers across, pencil drawings of birds and flowers covering pages, torn from an old composition notebook. She showed them to him, shyly, explaining each one in a soft voice that barely carried. The cardinal was from a tree they'd seen near the bus station. The wildflowers grew along the path to the house. Drawing helped when her chest hurt, she said, gave her something to focus on besides the pain. Kenny asked if she could draw him a dog, and she smiled, the first real expression that had crossed either woman's face since Owen arrived. Owen watched his son lean against Rosie's chair, completely at ease, chattering about the chickens he wanted to raise. The boy hadn't been this relaxed in months, not since before they'd lost the house. Something about these women, their quiet presence, had softened the sharp edges of Kenny's usual wariness. Or maybe Kenny just recognized kindred spirits, others who understood what it meant to have the ground pulled out from under you. Children were perceptive that way, seeing connections adults tried to rationalize away. The practical part of Owen's brain screamed warnings. He barely had enough resources to support himself and Kenny, let alone 2 additional people. The farmhouse needed thousands of dollars in repairs he didn't have. Winter was coming, and the heating system was questionable at best. This was insanity, inviting complications into an already impossible situation. But the other part of him, the part that remembered what it felt like to have nowhere to go, couldn't form the words to make them leave. "I need to fix this place up," he heard himself say. "It's not livable yet, not really. No heat, roof leaks, floors are dangerous in spots." Hazel nodded, already gathering their few belongings. 2 backpacks that looked like they held everything they owned. But if you're willing to help with the work, you could stay, temporarily, until you figure something out. The words hung in the air like a held breath. Hazel froze, hands clutching a faded jacket. You don't have to. We can't ask. I'm not asking you to ask, Owen interrupted. I'm offering. I work most of the week in the city, can only come out on weekends. If you're here, you could start on smaller repairs. Keep an eye on the place. Hazel, you said your dad taught you about farming? She nodded slowly, still processing. Then you know more than I do. I bought this place with big dreams and no real knowledge. Maybe we could help each other. Rosie's hand had found Hazel's across the table, squeezing tight. The sisters exchanged a look that carried entire conversations. Hope and fear and disbelief mixing together. Kenny tugged Owen's sleeve. Dad, are they staying? Can Rosie teach me to draw? The innocent question decided everything, tipping the balance from impossible to merely improbable. Owen nodded, and Hazel's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She didn't cry, exactly, but her eyes went bright and she pressed her lips together hard, fighting for control. We'll earn our keep, she managed. I promise. We won't be a burden. Owen thought about the last 2 years of his life, the burden of hospital bills and funeral costs, of raising a grieving child alone, of working himself ragged for pennies, and hope. Burden was too simple a word for what people carried when the world fell apart around them. What they were really talking about was survival, the messy collaborative kind that didn't fit neatly into categories of charity or debt. Let's just try to keep the roof from caving in, he said instead. Everything else, we'll figure out as we go. The first weekend set the pattern. Owen arrived Friday evening with his truck loaded with salvaged materials, wood planks a construction site was throwing away, mismatched shingles from a warehouse clearance, tools borrowed from his supervisor who'd taken pity on his situation. Hazel met him on the porch with a list she'd compiled, organized by urgency and feasibility. The woman was methodical, Owen discovered, with an eye for structural priorities he lacked. She'd identified the worst roof sections, mapped out which floor joists needed reinforcement, even sketched plans for reorganizing the kitchen to maximize the functional workspace. They worked in careful coordination, Hazel handing Owen tools as he patched the roof. Rosie keeping Kenny entertained with drawing lessons in the yard below. The sisters had cleaned the house thoroughly in the intervening week, scrubbing years of grime until windows let in actual light. They'd also started clearing the vegetable garden plot Hazel's father had taught her to identify. Southern exposure, good drainage, protected from the worst winds. Without asking permission, without expecting anything in return, they'd simply begun caring for the place like it mattered. Owen found himself watching them work between his own tasks. The way Hazel approached each project, with quiet competence, never complaining about splinters or sore muscles. How Rosie moved carefully but persistently, resting when her breathing grew labored, but always returning to help. They rationed their energy like it was precious, which it was, pushing themselves to contribute despite obvious exhaustion. Pride, Owen realized. They needed to feel useful, to prove they deserved the space he'd offered. He understood that impulse intimately. Meals became communal affairs, simple but somehow significant. Hazel had a talent for stretching ingredients, making filling stews from vegetables she'd found growing wild on the property and dried beans from their meager supplies. She insisted on contributing to the food budget from the small amount she'd saved, an argument Owen lost when she pointed out that they were eating the meals too. Rosie set the table with wildflowers in a chipped mason jar, small touches that made the dilapidated kitchen feel almost homey. Kenny chattered through dinner, telling the sisters about school and friends, performing the normalcy of childhood for an audience that actually listened. The second weekend, Owen taught Kenny how to hammer nails, while Hazel worked on replacing rotted porch boards. Rosie sat nearby, drawing their progress, and later Owen found she'd sketched them, him and Kenny side by side, both focused on their work, the family resemblance obvious in profile. She offered it shyly, and he tacked it to the wall in what would eventually be Kenny's bedroom, the first decoration in their new home, rendered by someone who'd been a stranger 2 weeks ago. Progress came in inches. The roof no longer leaked, at least not in the main sections. 3 upstairs rooms had stable floors. The kitchen plumbing worked more often than it failed. But more than the physical improvements, something else was building. A rhythm. A sense of collective purpose. Owen found himself explaining his plans for the property during dinner, and Hazel would add practical considerations he hadn't thought of. Rosie suggested wildflower beds near the house, both beautiful and beneficial for pollinators, if they ever got crops going. Kenny declared they needed a tire swing in the old oak tree, and nobody argued. It wasn't the farmhouse Owen had imagined when he'd signed the papers. That vision had been simpler, cleaner, just him and Kenny against the world. This was more complicated, messier, full of variables he couldn't control. But sitting on the porch at sunset that third weekend, watching Kenny show Rosie how he'd learned to identify animal tracks in the mud, while Hazel planned next week's garden prep, Owen felt something he'd almost forgotten. Not just possibility, but presence, the sense of being part of something larger than his own struggle. By the 4th weekend, they'd stopped asking permission. Hazel met him with her list, but also with suggestions, additions, her own vision of what the place could become. Rosie had started a compost pile without being asked. Kenny lobbied for chickens, backed by Hazel's knowledge of coop construction and Rosie's offer to draw up plans. They moved around each other with increasing ease, less like strangers sharing space and more like people building something together. The neighboring properties remained distant, but not entirely isolated. An older farmer from down the road stopped by one Saturday, ostensibly to warn them about coyotes in the area, but really to check out the new residents. He looked at Owen, at the women working alongside him, at Kenny playing in the yard, and something in his weathered face softened. Brought them eggs from his chickens the next week, refused payment, said they'd return the favor once they got settled. Small-town politics, Owen realized, testing whether they'd be good neighbors, whether they belonged. The real test came the 6th weekend, when early October brought the first hard frost. Owen arrived to find Hazel frantically trying to save the vegetable starts she'd been nurturing, Rosie helping, despite obvious difficulty breathing in the cold air. They'd been covering plants with whatever they could find, moving potted seedlings into the house, fighting to preserve weeks of work. Owen joined without question, and together they saved most of the garden. Afterward, mud-covered and exhausted, they heated water for tea and wrapped in blankets around the wood stove Hazel had somehow gotten working properly. "Your father taught you well," Owen said, watching steam rise from his cup. Hazel smiled softly. He was a farmer before the economy forced him into factory work, never stopped missing it. Used to say land doesn't lie to you, doesn't lay you off, doesn't care about your education or connections. You put in honest work, it gives honest results. "Is that why you knew what to do here?" Kenny asked, nestled against Rosie. "Muscle memory, maybe. Or hope. Working with growing things makes me feel close to him again." Hazel's voice caught slightly. "Like he's still teaching me, still here in some way." Owen understood that completely. Sometimes he felt his wife's presence in Kenny's laugh. In the stubborn way the boy pursued things he cared about despite obstacles. The dead didn't leave cleanly. They lingered in skills taught, values passed down, the way survivors approach the world. "We should plant fruit trees in spring," Rosie suggested quietly. "Long-term investment. They'd belong to whoever's here." The unspoken question hung between them. Who would that be? They'd been careful never to discuss the future beyond the immediate next weekend, never to presume permanence. But fruit trees took years to mature. Planting them meant believing in a future that included this place, these people. Owen looked at Kenny, who'd fallen asleep against Rosie's side, at Hazel, cradling her tea like it was precious, at the house around them, still broken but less so every week. Apple trees, he said. And maybe some pear. Hazel's eyes met his across the dim room, and something shifted. Not quite a promise, but an acknowledgement. Whatever was happening between them, it mattered enough to plan for seasons they hadn't yet seen together. November arrived with unexpected warmth before winter's full arrival. Owen had managed to negotiate more flexible hours at the warehouse, allowing him to work 4 10-hour shifts and spend 3 full days at the farmhouse. The arrangement meant less money, but more presence, more time to see actual progress, more evenings around the kitchen table, more moments watching Kenny thrive in ways he never had in the cramped city apartment. The house had transformed in ways that seemed impossible given their limited resources. Hazel's systematic approach and Owen's determined labor had turned 3 upstairs rooms fully livable. The kitchen functioned reliably now, the roof was sound, and they'd started on the barn, clearing enough space to house the chickens Owen had finally agreed to get. The property looked less like abandonment and more like potential, like a place people actually lived rather than merely survived. But the real transformation was harder to quantify. It showed in Kenny's confidence, the way he moved through the property like he owned it, pointing out improvements to anyone who'd listen. In Rosie's health, the country air and reduced stress had minimized her episodes, let her work on larger projects without constant breaks. In Hazel's face, where the tight wariness had gradually loosened into something approaching peace. In Owen himself, who'd started sleeping through the night, who caught himself laughing at Kenny's jokes, who no longer measured every moment in terms of what it cost. They'd fallen into patterns that felt suspiciously like family. Hazel cooked breakfast while Owen and Kenny did morning chores. Rosie taught Kenny to read cloud patterns and bird behavior. Owen and Hazel worked on repairs during the day, falling into easy conversation that ranged from practical to personal. Evenings meant dinner together, then Kenny's bedtime routine that now included Rosie reading while Owen tucked him in, then quiet time when adults could finally be adults, talking on the porch, planning, sharing the kind of stories people tell when trust has been earned. Owen had started noticing things about Hazel he probably shouldn't. The way she pushed hair behind her ear when concentrating, how her laugh started quiet, but grew when she really meant it. The competence in her hands, capable and sure, whether wielding tools or preparing food. She approached everything with the same steady determination. Obstacles were problems to solve, not reasons to quit. He recognized that quality because he saw it in his mirror every morning, that stubborn refusal to let circumstances win. He thought maybe she'd noticed things about him too, the way her eyes tracked him moving around the property, how she'd started asking his opinion before making decisions, not because she needed permission, but because his input mattered to her. The coffee she'd started making exactly how he liked it without being told. Small things, easily dismissed, except they weren't small, and he wasn't dismissing them. The shift came on a Tuesday evening in mid-November. Owen had stayed through the week for the first time, taking a few days off work to finish winterizing the house before the real cold arrived. Rosie had taken Kenny to Sketchbirds near the pond, giving the adult space for the heavy work of insulating the attic. They'd been working in comfortable silence when Hazel spoke. "Can I ask you something personal?" Owen looked up from the insulation he was cutting. "Sure." "Why did you let us stay?" The question was direct, vintage Hazel. "That first day. You had every reason to call the police, protect your investment. Instead, you offered to share it. Why?" Owen sat back on his heels, considering. "Honestly, I saw myself. 2 years ago, standing in a hospital being told my wife had maybe 3 months, that the treatment keeping her alive was bankrupting us. I had a choice: keep fighting for time we wouldn't get anyway, or accept defeat and try to salvage something for Kenny. I chose wrong, probably. Spent everything trying to delay the inevitable. When she died, I had nothing left except debt and a kid who'd watched his mother disappear over months. He paused, finding words for things he rarely voiced. I was so angry. At the cancer, at the medical system, at myself for not being able to fix it, at her for leaving, which I knew wasn't fair but felt anyway. I would have done anything for somewhere safe to fall apart, somewhere Kenny could just be a kid while I figured out how to keep going. You and Rosie, that first day, I saw that same desperation, and I thought, maybe I can't fix what happened to me, but I can keep it from being worse for someone else. Hazel had stopped working, was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. That's not pity, though. You don't treat us like charity cases. Because you're not. Pity is condescending. This is just, he gestured vaguely, people helping each other. You've done as much for this place as I have. More, probably, since you're here full-time. That's not charity. That's partnership. Partnership, Hazel repeated softly, like she was testing the word. Is that what we're doing? The question held layers Owen wasn't sure he was ready to explore, but Hazel's eyes were steady, patient, waiting for honesty. I think it started that way. Practical arrangement, mutual benefit. But somewhere in the last 3 months, it became something else. At least for me. What kind of something else? Owen set down his tools, giving her his full attention. The kind where I look forward to Friday all week, where I catch myself thinking about what you'd say about things that happen at work, where I see Kenny happy, really happy, and know it's partly because you and Rosie are here. He took a breath. Where I imagine next spring and summer, and you're in those images, not as temporary help, but as permanent presence. Hazel's hands twisted together, a rare sign of nervousness. Rosie and I, we've been careful not to assume anything, not to presume on your generosity or make you feel obligated. But I'd be lying if I said we wanted to leave. This place feels like we belong here, like we're building something that matters. You do belong here, Owen said firmly. You and Rosie, you're part of this now, part of what makes it home. Home, Hazel echoed, and her eyes went bright. We haven't had that since the fire. Didn't think we would again. Owen moved closer, giving her space to retreat if she wanted. She didn't. I can't promise it'll be easy. Money's still tight. Winter's going to be hard. Kenny's still grieving, and that surfaces in unexpected ways. This place needs years of work I'm not sure we can afford. We, Hazel noted. You said we. Yeah, I did. Owen reached for her hand, half expecting her to pull back. Instead, her fingers wrapped around his, calloused and warm and sure. If you're willing, if this is something you want too. I want this. Rosie wants this. We want you and Kenny, this place, this life we're building together. Hazel's voice was steady despite the tears sliding down her face. I haven't let myself hope for anything in so long, but you make me hope again. Owen pulled her close, and she came willingly, folding into his arms like she'd been made to fit there. They stayed that way for a long moment, breathing together, feeling the solid reality of each other. When they finally pulled back, Hazel was smiling through tears, and Owen felt something in his chest unlock that had been closed since his wife died. Kenny's going to be insufferable about this, Owen said, making her laugh. He's been matchmaking for weeks. So has Rosie. Apparently we've been obvious to everyone but ourselves. Hazel wiped her eyes. So what happens now? Now we finish insulating this attic before we freeze, Owen said practically. Then we tell the kids. Then we keep doing what we've been doing, working together, building something good. And long-term, Owen considered, looking around the attic that would someday be properly finished. part of a home they were creating together. Long term, I'm hoping you'll marry me. Not now, not rushed, but eventually, when we're sure, when it's right. Hazel's breath caught. That's quite a hope. You told me I make you hope again. Seemed fair to return the favor. Owen grinned. Too much too soon? No, Hazel said softly. It's exactly enough. Exactly right. She kissed him then, gentle and certain, sealing promises they were just beginning to make. Below them, they could hear Kenny and Rosie returning, voices carrying through the November air. Their family, still forming, already real. Winter tested them in ways autumn hadn't prepared them for. The old farmhouse, despite their repairs, struggled against January's brutal cold. Pipes froze twice. The wood stove became their lifeline, all four of them sleeping in the living room some nights when temperatures plunged below zero. Money got tighter as Owen's hours reduced during the warehouse's slow season. They ate simply, stretched every dollar, made do with what they had. It was hard in ways that would have broken Owen a year ago, but they faced it together, and that made all the difference. Hazel's practical nature and ability to improvise turned potential disasters into mere inconveniences. Rosie's creativity transformed scarcity into adventure, making games of rationing firewood and inventing recipes from limited ingredients. Kenny adapted with the resilience of childhood, treating the whole experience as an extended camping trip. Owen found himself grateful for the challenges, oddly enough, because they proved the four of them could weather difficulties without fracturing. The community slowly opened to them, too. The neighboring farmer who'd brought eggs became a regular visitor, offering advice and occasional use of equipment. His wife started including Hazel and Rosie in the informal network of rural women who swapped preserves and recipes and support. Kenny made friends at the small local school, bringing home invitations to birthday parties and playdates. People stopped seeing them as the odd urban family who'd taken over the abandoned farmhouse and started seeing them as neighbors, as people who belonged. Owen and Hazel navigated their relationship with the same careful pragmatism they applied to the farm. They were affectionate, but not performative. Their connection evident in small touches and shared glances rather than grand gestures. They worked together seamlessly, had learned each other's rhythms and preferences through months of proximity. Rosie and Kenny had adjusted to the shift easily, treating it as natural evolution rather than dramatic change. The four of them simply fit, like pieces that had always been meant to connect. February brought Owen's proposal, official and proper, despite their earlier conversation. He did it on the porch at sunset, Kenny and Rosie witnessing, with a simple ring he'd saved 2 months to afford. Hazel said yes before he finished asking, laughing and crying simultaneously. They set the date for June, wanting warm weather and time to prepare, wanting the farm to be fully alive when they made their promises permanent. March meant mud and early planting, following the charts Hazel had marked from her father's old farming almanac. They put in cold weather crops, prepared beds for summer vegetables, started seedlings in the windows. The fruit trees arrived in early April, 3 apple varieties and 2 pear, just as they'd planned in that first October conversation. They planted them together, all 4 taking turns with the shovel, staking the young trees carefully. Owen caught Hazel watching the orchard plot with such profound contentment that he had to kiss her, right there in the mud, while Kenny and Rosie made exaggerated gagging noises. The barn became functional enough for actual livestock. 6 chickens arrived, an assortment of breeds chosen for both eggs and personality. Kenny took to them immediately, naming each one and checking for eggs 3 times daily. Rosie sketched them constantly, capturing their ridiculous dignity in ways that made everyone laugh. The chickens provided eggs, entertainment, and the satisfying sense of the farm becoming actually functional rather than merely aspirational. Rosie's health had stabilized remarkably. Regular doctor visits, affordable now that Owen's benefits covered all 4 of them, showed her heart function improving. The cardiologist attributed it to reduced stress, better nutrition, and the physical activity she could now pace herself through. She'd started taking online classes, working toward finishing her interrupted degree, talking about maybe becoming a teacher someday. Watching her plan for a future she could actually envision felt like witnessing a resurrection. Someone coming back to life after merely existing. May brought endless tasks, wedding preparation competing with spring planting, the urgency of both requiring impossible time management. But neighbors pitched in without being asked, helping with repairs and bringing casseroles and offering their church's fellowship hall at family discount rates. The farmer's wife helped Hazel find a simple dress at a consignment shop, altered to fit perfectly. Rosie designed wildflower arrangements. Kenny practiced being ring bearer with theatrical solemnity. Owen watched it all come together and felt wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with money. They married on the first Saturday in June, in the yard between the house and the barn, with 50 people they'd known less than a year bearing witness. The ceremony was simple: a local justice of the peace, traditional vows, rings exchanged in the golden light of late afternoon. But the emotion was profound. When Owen promised to love and cherish Hazel, he was promising to honor everything they'd already built together, everything they'd survived, everything they would face going forward. When Hazel made her vows, tears streaming down her face, Owen heard all the things she couldn't say aloud: gratitude and hope, and the kind of love that grows from truly seeing another person. Kenny and Rosie stood beside them as family, not as afterthoughts, but as integral parts of what was being formed. 4 people who'd been broken separately, now choosing to be whole together. The witnesses applauded, and someone started music, and the celebration unfolded with the easy joy of people who knew how to value happiness when they found it. The first full year of marriage settled into patterns that felt inevitable, like they'd always been heading toward this configuration of life. The farmhouse had evolved from rehabilitation project to actual home. Curtains in windows, rugs on floors, photographs on walls documenting their combined history. Owen had managed to negotiate a permanent 3-day schedule at the warehouse, spending the rest of his time developing the farm. The income wasn't great, but between his paycheck, Hazel's growing produce sales at the local market, and Rosie's online tutoring income, they made it work. The vegetable garden had exploded into productivity, Hazel's knowledge combining with hard work to create abundance. They sold surplus at the farmer's market, building a reputation for quality and reliability. Customers started requesting specific items, asking when tomatoes would be ready or whether they'd have basil this week. Hazel glowed during market days, in her element, making connections and transactions that proved they were building something sustainable. Kenny had grown 3 inches and gained confidence Owen barely recognized. The quiet, anxious child who'd been so careful after losing his mother had transformed into a boy who ran full speed, who climbed trees and caught frogs and talked endlessly about everything. He called Hazel Mom now, naturally and without prompting, and she responded with the same fierce, protective love she showed Rosie. The family had reorganized around the simple truth that biology mattered less than presence, that the people who showed up became your people, regardless of formal relationships. Rosie had bloomed in quieter but equally significant ways. Her online courses were going well, her health continued stable, and she'd started selling her drawings at the market alongside Hazel's produce. Local people commissioned pieces, their homes, their pets, their children. She was saving money, talking about maybe getting her own small place nearby someday, independent but close. Hazel worried about that, but Rosie insisted. She needed to prove to herself she could manage alone, even if alone meant a mile down the road rather than truly separate. Owen's relationship with Hazel had deepened in ways he hadn't thought possible after losing his first wife. They were partners in every sense, working the farm together, raising Kenny together, planning futures together. But they were also individuals, respecting each other's need for space and separate identity. Hazel pushed him to dream bigger for the farm. He pushed her to value her own contributions rather than always deferring. They argued sometimes, usually about money or priorities. But they'd learned to fight constructively, to voice frustrations before they festered. The neighboring farmer had become Owen's unofficial mentor, teaching him the 1,000 small skills farming required. How to read weather, when to plant what, how to manage soil health and pest pressure, and the endless small decisions that meant the difference between success and failure. In exchange, Owen helped with repairs and heavy work the older man couldn't manage alone anymore. The relationship was mutually beneficial in ways the city had never offered. Genuine community, where people invested in each other's success because they understood interdependence. September brought harvest, the vegetables coming in faster than they could process. They spent evenings canning and freezing, preserving plenty for winter with surplus to sell. The barn now housed not just chickens, but 2 goats Hazel had acquired through a complicated barter involving vegetables, repair work, and a promise to share any future offspring. The goats provided milk, entertainment, and the sense that the farm was becoming a real, functional operation. The fruit trees they'd planted 18 months ago were thriving, too young to fruit yet, but growing strong. Owen had started marking their heights on the barn wall, like parents measure children. Documenting progress. Those trees were long-term investment, commitment to a future that extended beyond next season. They'd bear fruit when Kenny was in high school, when Rosie had finished her degree, when Owen and Hazel had gray hair and grandchildren to teach about farming. The thought didn't frighten Owen the way long-term planning once had. It felt like promise rather than pressure. One October evening, the 4 of them sat on the porch watching sunset paint the sky impossible colors. The harvest was mostly complete, the farm prepared for another winter, and they'd just finished a meal of their own vegetables and eggs from their own chickens. Simple food, but earned, and that made it taste better than anything Owen remembered from before. "Dad," Kenny said, leaning against Owen's side, "tell me again how you found this place." Owen smiled, pulling his son close. "I was looking for something cheap I could maybe fix up. I found this old farmhouse nobody else wanted." "And then you found us," Hazel added, her hand finding Owen's. "The best mistake I ever made," Owen agreed. "Came back expecting an empty house and found a family instead." Rosie laughed. "Pretty sure we thought we'd found temporary shelter and stumbled into permanent home." "Speaking of permanent," Hazel said carefully, "I have something to tell you all." The tone made everyone look at her. She was smiling, nervous but happy, one hand resting on her stomach in a gesture that communicated everything before she spoke. "I'm pregnant, about 8 weeks along." The doctor confirmed it yesterday. The words hung in the cooling air for a heartbeat before Kenny erupted in excitement, demanding to know if it would be a brother or sister, and could they name it after one of the chickens, and would it help feed the goats? Rosie hugged Hazel tight, eyes bright with tears. Owen found himself frozen, joy and terror competing for dominance. "You okay?" Hazel asked, reading his face correctly. "Yeah," Owen managed. "Just processing. A baby. Here. With us." "Too much?" Hazel's voice carried concern. "I know we didn't exactly plan this, and money's still tight." "It's perfect," Owen interrupted, finding his voice. "Overwhelming and terrifying and perfect." He pulled her close, feeling her relax against him. A baby born into this. Into family and farmhouse and everything we've built. Spring baby, Rosie calculated. April or May. The farm will be beautiful. "We'll need to finish that last bedroom," Owen said, mind already working through logistics. "And figure out childcare when we're both working. And And we'll figure it out, Hazel finished. Like we've figured out everything else. Together. Kenny squeezed between them, small hands reaching to touch Hazel's stomach, even though there was nothing to feel yet. Can we tell the chickens? He asked seriously. They should know they're getting a new sibling. Everyone laughed, the sound carrying across the property they'd reclaimed from abandonment. Owen looked at his family, the son he'd managed to keep safe despite everything, the wife he'd found in the least expected way, the sister who'd become family through persistence and presence, and the child not yet visible but already loved. This farmhouse that had been his last desperate hope had become their collective salvation, the foundation for something none of them could have built alone. The sunset faded to purple, then deep blue. Stars emerged, more visible here than in the city, untouched by light pollution. The four of them stayed on the porch, talking about preparations needed for the baby, about winter projects, about dreams for next year's expanded garden. Ordinary conversation, the kind families have when they're planning futures they believe in. Owen thought about that first day, 3 weeks after buying the place, when he'd opened the door expecting emptiness and found 2 terrified women making bread in his kitchen. How he'd stood there deciding whether to embrace complication or enforce his claim to solitude. How he'd chosen connection over safety, shared struggle over protected independence. That single moment had redirected everything, had opened possibilities he'd been too hurt and exhausted to imagine. People talked about finding home like it was a destination, a place you arrived and stayed. But Owen understood now that home was something you built, day by day, with people who became family through the accumulated weight of shared moments. It was the farmhouse, yes, but more importantly, it was Kenny's laughter and Hazel's competence and Rosie's quiet strength. It was chickens, named after poets, and goats who escaped their pen weekly. It was vegetables grown from saved seeds and fruit trees planted for children not yet born. It was choosing, over and over, to face whatever came next together rather than apart. As darkness settled completely, they migrated inside to the warmth of the wood stove, to mugs of hot cider, and the comfortable silence of people who didn't need constant conversation to feel connected. Owen looked around the kitchen they'd rebuilt, at faces illuminated by lamplight, at the life they'd constructed from what the world had tried to take from them. Some people bought abandoned farmhouses planning to restore them to previous glory. Owen had bought one and discovered something better, the chance to build something entirely new from shared wreckage. To take 4 broken stories and weave them into one narrative of resilience, hope, and the stubborn insistence that family was what you made of it. The farmhouse had been empty when he bought it. Now it overflowed with the kind of richness that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with choosing each other, daily, in all the small and large ways that mattered. That was worth more than any property, more than any inheritance, more than any success measured in conventional terms. It was worth everything.